The sound of metal striking concrete echoed through the hardware store as the box of screws slipped from Jason Bennett's fingers. His world narrowed to a pinpoint focus on the small girl standing before him, her index finger pointed directly at his exposed wrist. Sometimes the greatest secrets in life aren't what we hide from others, but what's been hidden from us. Jason's throat constricted as he knelt to collect the scattered screws, his calloused fingers trembling against the cold floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the aisle, where his 8-year-old daughter Lucy tugged impatiently at his flannel sleeve. "Dad, that girl's staring at us." He followed Lucy's gaze to find a child, perhaps a year older than his daughter, wearing a velvet headband that tamed dark curls, and a navy dress with pristine white collar, the unmistakable uniform of private school privilege. The girl's patent leather shoes gleamed under the store lights as she approached with deliberate steps, shoulders squared with practiced poise. But it was her eyes that stopped Jason's breath, green with flecks of gold around the pupils. His eyes, the same eyes that stared back at him each morning in the mirror. "Hello, sir," the girl said, her voice carrying the careful enunciation of expensive education. "My mother has a tattoo just like yours." The phoenix design on Jason's wrist wasn't from any shop. It had been sketched on a coffee-stained napkin 10 years ago, the night before Allison, now apparently Rebecca, had vanished from his life without explanation. A night when they'd talked about broken wings learning to fly again, about rising from ashes, about forever. A forever that had lasted exactly 3 weeks before she'd stopped answering his calls. The clicking of expensive heels against linoleum signaled an approaching figure, and Jason knew before looking up. Some sounds carve themselves into memory and wait, dormant for the moment circumstance resurrects them. She was different now, hair cut in a severe bob that framed cheekbones he'd once traced with reverent fingers, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost what he made in a month. Gone was the art student with paint-stained fingers, replaced by someone polished to a dangerous sheen. But her eyes, those hadn't changed. Still that particular shade of gray that had always reminded him of October skies before rain. They widened now with unmistakable recognition and terror. "Grace!" Her voice was tight, controlled. "We need to go. Now." "But mother, I was just—" "Now, Grace!" She seized the girl's hand, pulling her away with the desperate grace of someone fleeing a crime scene. The girl, Grace, looked back over her shoulder, confusion etched across features that were a perfect blend of her mother's delicate beauty and Jason's stubborn jawline. "Dad!" Lucy's small voice pierced his daze. "Who was that lady? Why did she run away?" Jason couldn't answer. His mind was calculating months, counting backward to that last night with Allison before she disappeared. The hotel room, the rain against windows, the promises about making it work despite the distance. 9 months. Grace was 9 years old. The math was simple. The implications were apocalyptic. For 3 days, Jason moved through life in a fog. His hands performed familiar tasks in his woodworking shop, while his mind spun in useless circles. He barely tasted his food. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of a girl with his eyes calling him, "Sir." "You're doing it wrong, Dad." Lucy's voice pulled him back to reality as they sat at the kitchen table, where he'd been absent-mindedly helping her with homework. "You're supposed to multiply, not add." "Sorry, Pumpkin." He rubbed his eyes. "Dad's a little distracted." "Because of that girl at the hardware store?" Lucy asked, her green eyes, so like his mother's, studying him with unnerving perception. "The one who looks sad." Jason hesitated. "What made you think she looked sad?" Lucy shrugged. "She looked at us like we were Christmas presents she wasn't allowed to open." Out of the mouths of babes. 2 years since cancer had taken Claire, and Jason had learned that 8-year-olds often saw truths adults tried to hide. His phone chimed with a search alert. He'd spent hours the night before, after Lucy was asleep, searching for Rebecca Collins and Collins Art Foundation. The results had been illuminating. Executive director of her family's multi-million-dollar arts foundation, featured in social pages at gallery openings, a Yale degree, and a Manhattan address that screamed old money. Not a single mention of a daughter. Saturday morning found Jason and Lucy at the farmer's market, buying tomatoes for the sauce Claire had taught him to make when a flash of familiar dark hair caught his eye. Rebecca stood alone at a vendor's stall, examining heirloom vegetables with the same intense focus she'd once applied to her canvases. "Lucy," he said quietly, pressing a $10 bill into his daughter's hand, "go pick out some pastries for breakfast tomorrow. I'll be right back." He approached Rebecca slowly, giving her time to notice him. She went still, closing her eyes briefly as if praying for a different outcome. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There's nothing to talk about." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she placed a tomato back in its basket. "She has my eyes, Rebecca, and my jaw." Jason kept his voice low. "You ran the second we met. I think I deserve an explanation." Before she could respond, excited voices approached. Lucy and Grace walked toward them, paper bags of pastries in hand and matching grins on their faces. "Dad, look who I found. Her nanny brought her to get bread." Lucy was practically vibrating with excitement. "Can she come play at our house, please? We can work on the treehouse." Grace looked up at her mother with such hopeful eyes that Jason felt his chest tighten. "Mother, may I? Lucy says they're building a treehouse, and I could help." Rebecca looked between the two girls, then at Jason. He watched a decade of carefully constructed walls crumble in real time. Her shoulders sagged. Her breath came shorter. When she met his eyes, he saw surrender there, mixed with terror and something that might have been relief. "1 hour," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "You can visit for 1 hour, and then Catherine will pick you up." Grace's face lit up with unguarded joy, and Jason recognized his own smile in hers. As the girls ran ahead toward his truck, Rebecca grabbed his arm. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm morning. "Jason," she stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "There are things you don't know, things I can't explain here. Please be careful with her. She's fragile, more than she seems." Jason studied her face, seeing the shadows under her eyes, fine lines that hadn't been there a decade ago, the weight of secrets etched into her features. "I need to know the truth, Rebecca. Whatever it is, whatever happened, I need to know." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw her warring with herself, saw the moment she made a decision. "Come to my house tonight after the girls are asleep. I'll tell you everything." She pulled out a business card and wrote an address on the back. 8 o'clock. Come alone. The hour with the girls was simultaneously wonderful and agonizing. Grace had clearly never used a hammer before, but approached each nail with serious concentration. She asked careful questions about measurements and weight distribution, her vocabulary far more advanced than Lucy's. When Lucy showed her how to draw plans in the dirt with a stick, Grace's face lit up with unguarded delight. "We don't get to do this at home," she confided. "Mother says dirt ruins clothes." They could have been sisters, Jason thought as he watched them. They moved the same way, tilted their heads at the same angle when thinking. Lucy's auburn hair and fair skin came from Claire, while Grace had Rebecca's darker coloring. But underneath the surface differences, the architecture was identical. When Catherine arrived, a stern woman in her 60s, who introduced herself as Grace's nanny and shot Jason a look that said she'd memorized his face for a future police lineup, Grace hugged Lucy goodbye with fierce desperation. "Can we do this again?" she asked, looking between Lucy and Jason with such hope it physically hurt. Lucy answered before Jason could. "Yes, we can work on the treehouse every day until it's done." Grace's smile could have powered cities. The address Rebecca had given him led to a neighborhood Jason had only ever driven through. Houses hid behind stone walls and ancient trees where money wasn't flaunted because it didn't need to be. The gate opened at his approach, and he followed a winding drive to a modern masterpiece of glass and steel. Rebecca answered the door herself, barefoot in jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, closer to the girl he'd known. "Come in," she said quietly, leading him through a foyer that was more art gallery than home. Soaring ceilings, carefully curated paintings, sculpture that probably cost more than his house. She led him to a study lined with books, poured them both whiskey from a crystal decanter, and handed him a glass with shaking hands. They stood like that for a moment, the weight of 10 years pressing down on the space between them. "Her name is Grace Collins," Rebecca began, her voice flat with rehearsed control. "She's 9 years old, born March 14th at Presbyterian Hospital in New York. She plays violin at a pre-conservatory level, speaks 3 languages, and has never had a birthday party with more than 2 other children present." She took a long drink of her whiskey and continued. "She's never met her father, has no idea who he is, and I've spent 9 years making sure it stays that way." "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. Rebecca finally turned to face him, raw anguish in her expression. "Because telling you would have destroyed everything you had. Because I left to give you a chance at a real life, not the half existence I could offer." She set down her glass and wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very small. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I left. I was in New York starting the gallery job, and I took a test in a convenience store bathroom at 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, kept throwing up. Couldn't pretend it was just stress anymore." Her voice cracked and she paused to collect herself. "I sat on that dirty floor with a plastic stick in my hand, and I thought about calling you. God, Jason, I thought about it for days. I had my phone out 100 times. But then I did what I always do. I researched. I looked you up online, checked social media." She met his eyes and hers were swimming now. "You were engaged to Claire. You'd posted photos from a dinner where you proposed. You looked so happy, Jason, so fundamentally at peace in a way you never looked with me." Jason felt like the floor had dropped away. "You were pregnant with my child and you didn't tell me because I'd moved on?" The anger in his voice was sharp, but underneath it was something much more complicated. Rebecca laughed, but it was bitter. "Not just moved on, you'd found what you needed. Claire was, God, even in those photos, I could see she was steady, present, everything I wasn't. I was chaos, Jason. I was ambition and restlessness. And I would have pulled you away from your family, your business, everything that grounded you. And for what? A relationship that was already falling apart before I left?" She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I loved you enough to let you be happy, even if it meant raising our daughter alone." The silence that followed was heavy with all the different futures that had died that day in a New York bathroom. "You didn't just decide for yourself, Rebecca." Jason's voice, when he finally found it, was rough. "You decided for me, for Grace. You took away my choice." She nodded slowly. "I know, and I've lived with that guilt every single day." She took a steadying breath. "Then 6 months after Grace was born, my father died. I inherited the Collins Foundation, millions of dollars, property, investments, all tied up in trusts and legal structures." She turned to face him fully, exhaustion carved into her features. "I wasn't just some art student who got lucky with a gallery job. I was a trust fund kid trying to build something on my own before the money swallowed me. And when it did, when I became Grace's only parent and sole heir to everything my family built, I made a choice. I built walls. I kept her safe, kept her private. Did Claire know? It was a question he hadn't planned to ask, but suddenly needed answered. Rebecca shook her head. How would she? I made sure every trace of my pregnancy disappeared. Used my mother's maiden name at the hospital, had the birth registered under a different last name initially. She paused, then added softly, I'm sorry about Claire. I read about it online. I thought about reaching out then, but Jason cut her off. But what? You thought I'd had enough suffering? Didn't need to know I had another daughter? I thought you deserved to grieve in peace, she whispered. I thought adding this truth would only multiply the pain. That wasn't your call to make. But his anger was fading now, replaced by something more complex. Grief for all the moments he'd missed, mixed with understanding he didn't want to feel. Why didn't you tell me when Claire died? He asked finally. You had 2 years. 2 years where telling me wouldn't have destroyed an existing family. Rebecca's face crumpled. Because by then I was terrified. Terrified you'd hate me. Terrified you'd take Grace away. Terrified she'd hate me for keeping you from her. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I built this entire life around the story that her father was a brief relationship that didn't work out, that he didn't know about her and was happier that way. I told her he was a good man who loved building things, who had kind hands, who would have loved her if he'd known she existed. Her voice broke completely. I told her about the tattoos, showed her mine, told her somewhere in the world was a person with the matching one who carried a piece of her in his heart, even though he didn't know it. It was the only truth I could give her. Jason moved without thinking, crossing the space between them and pulling her into his arms. She collapsed against him, a decade of held tears finally breaking free. He was crying too, silent tears for everything they'd lost, for everything they'd done to each other in the name of love. When Rebecca finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes red-rimmed. What do we do now, she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jason wiped his own face with the back of his hand and took a shaky breath. Now? Now you tell me everything. Every birthday I missed, every milestone, every word she said, and step she took. You tell me about her, really tell me, and then we figure out how to be honest with her together. Rebecca nodded slowly, relief warring with fear on her face. She asks about you, you know, about her father. She has this fantasy that you're out there somewhere, that someday you'll find each other. I've tried to prepare her for disappointment, but she's so hopeful, Jason. She's got your stubbornness and my dreaming, and it's this heartbreaking combination. Over the next 2 months, they navigated an impossible situation with the delicacy of people diffusing a bomb made of their own mistakes. They met for coffee while the girls were at school, awkward conversations about logistics and feelings that were easier to have in public. They texted throughout the day, updating each other on small things. Both girls were asking when they could play together again. Slowly, carefully, they started to build something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite co-parenting, but was honest in a way their relationship had never been. The girls, meanwhile, had decided they were best friends. Harper invited Grace to every activity. The treehouse building continued, but also trips to the library, the playground, the ice cream shop where Jason had been taking Lucy since she was tiny. Catherine initially accompanied Grace to everything with the vigilance of a Secret Service agent, but even she couldn't resist the simple joy of watching Grace be a regular kid. Jason watched his daughters together, and God, it still felt strange to think it, daughters plural, and saw Grace gradually shed layers of careful polish. She got sawdust in her hair and dirt on her expensive clothes. She shrieked with laughter when Lucy pushed her on the swing. She ate popsicles that dripped on her shoes and didn't immediately panic. She was learning to be a child instead of an heiress. Lucy, for her part, appointed herself Grace's guide to normal kid life. She taught Grace how to climb trees, how to make mud pies, how to draw with sidewalk chalk, and not worry about getting it perfect. When Grace had a nightmare during a sleepover, Lucy climbed into bed beside her and held her hand until she fell back asleep, the same way Claire used to do for Lucy. Jason watched all of this with his heart in his throat, knowing they were running out of time. Secrets had a way of growing toxic. Children weren't stupid. They'd figure it out eventually. Better to tell them the truth than let them stumble onto it. He broached the subject with Rebecca on a Thursday evening. "This weekend," he said, "we tell them this weekend." Rebecca's hand trembled around her mug of tea. "Are you sure they're ready?" Jason met her eyes. "Are we ready? Because that's the real question. The girls will handle this better than we will. Kids are resilient. It's us who are terrified." She was quiet for a moment, then gave a short laugh. "You're right. I've been a coward about this for 9 years. Another day won't make me braver." They planned it carefully. Saturday afternoon at Jason's house, just the four of them. Jason would start by explaining to Lucy that he just learned something important about Grace. Rebecca would help fill in details. They'd answer questions, reassure both girls that nothing bad was happening, that this was actually a good thing. Saturday arrived with perfect weather that felt like mockery. Lucy helped Jason make sandwiches for lunch, chattering about the fort she and Grace wanted to build in the treehouse now that the platform was finished. She was so happy, so uncomplicated in her joy about having a friend. And Jason felt the weight of what he was about to tell her. When Rebecca arrived with Grace, both girls ran immediately to the backyard to inspect the treehouse progress, giving the adults a few minutes alone. "I'm terrified," Rebecca admitted, and Jason took her hand without thinking. "Me too," he said, "but we're doing this together. Whatever happens, we face it together." They called the girls inside after lunch, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Grace and Lucy exchanged glances, their kid radar picking up on adult tension. They sat on the couch, side by side, a united front. "Girls," Jason started, then had to stop and clear his throat. "Lucy, Grace, we need to talk to you about something important, something we should have told you before, but we made some mistakes a long time ago, and we're trying to fix them now." Lucy's eyes were wide. "What kind of mistakes?" Jason took a breath. There was no easy way to say this. "Lucy, you know how you've always said you wished you had a sister?" His daughter nodded slowly. "Well, the thing is, you do. You have a sister. Grace is your sister." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucy looked at Grace, then at Jason, then at Rebecca, her 8-year-old mind working through the implications. Grace had gone very still, her expression unreadable. "I don't understand," Lucy said finally. "How can Grace be my sister? She has a different mom." This was the hard part. Jason glanced at Rebecca, who nodded and took over. "Grace, honey, do you remember the stories I told you about your father? About the kind man who liked building things?" Grace nodded slowly, and Jason saw hope kindling in her eyes, dangerous and bright. "The man I told you about, he's Jason, Lucy's dad. He's your father, too." The words hung in the air. Grace's face went through rapid changes: confusion, hope, disbelief, and finally a desperate kind of joy that made Jason's chest constrict. "You're my dad," she whispered, looking at him. "You're the one from the stories?" Jason nodded, not trusting his voice. Grace launched herself off the couch and into his arms with the force of 9 years of wanting, and Jason caught her, held her, felt her small body shaking with sobs against his chest. "I knew it," she gasped between tears. "I knew when I saw the tattoo. I knew you were him. Mother, I knew." Lucy was crying too. Rebecca pulled her into a hug while Lucy processed the revelation. "So Grace is my sister?" she asked through tears. "My real sister?" Rebecca smiled despite her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart, your real sister." Lucy looked at Grace, still clinging to Jason, and a grin broke across her face. I have a sister. I told you I always wanted a sister. The joy in her voice was so pure, so uncomplicated by adult concerns about timing and past mistakes, that Jason felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. Grace pulled back from his chest enough to look at Lucy, her face blotchy and tear-stained but radiant. I have a sister too, she said with wonder, and a dad. I have a family. The way she said it, with wonder and disbelief and fierce determination, like she was claiming something she'd fight to keep, broke something in Jason. He reached out and pulled Lucy into the embrace, both his daughters in his arms, and looked up to find Rebecca watching them with an expression that was equal parts grief and relief. "Come here," he said softly, and after a moment's hesitation, she joined them, completing the circle. They sat like that on the floor of Jason's living room, four people learning how to be a family in the wreckage of old mistakes and found truths, while outside the treehouse waited to be finished, and summer stretched endlessly ahead. The questions came later, of course. Lucy wanted to know why she hadn't known about Grace before, why Rebecca had kept it secret, why grown-ups were so complicated. Grace wanted to know everything about Jason, his favorite color, his favorite food, what he was like as a kid. Could she call him Dad? Was that too soon? Could she stay here whenever she wanted now? They answered as honestly as they could, stumbling over explanations about adult choices and difficult situations. In the end, Lucy summed it up with the kind of clarity only an 8-year-old could muster. "So you guys messed up, but now you're fixing it, and the important thing is we're all together now, right?" Jason had to laugh despite the tears on his face. "Yeah, baby, that's exactly right." The months that followed were a complicated dance of building something new from broken pieces. Rebecca hired lawyers to establish formal custody arrangements, insisting Jason have full legal recognition as Grace's father. Jason sold a major piece, a custom dining set featured in a home magazine, and put the money toward a college fund for Grace, matching the one he'd started for Lucy years ago. They had family dinners twice a week, awkward at first but growing easier as they learned each other's rhythms. Grace started calling Jason Dad with only slight hesitation, and the first time she said it naturally, asking him to pass the potatoes at dinner, he had to excuse himself to cry in the bathroom. On the first anniversary of the hardware store meeting, Jason finished the treehouse. It had taken longer than planned, but he'd added features as they went. A rope ladder Grace could climb, a pulley system for lifting supplies, carved initials for both girls in the support beams, a weatherproof box for their treasures. The girls declared it perfect and immediately claimed it as their fortress, hanging a sign that read, "Lucy and Grace's Castle, no adults except Dad." That made Jason laugh and ache simultaneously. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in the treehouse, despite Catherine's protests about proper beds, Jason and Rebecca sat on his back porch with beers and comfortable silence. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not hating me, for giving Grace what I couldn't." Jason considered that. "You gave her everything that mattered. You kept her safe. You raised an incredible kid." In the treehouse above them, Lucy and Grace slept tangled together in sleeping bags, their breathing synchronized, their hands loosely clasped even in sleep. Two girls who'd found each other despite every obstacle their parents had placed in the way. Who'd known before anyone told them that they were meant to be sisters. The phoenix on Jason's wrist caught the last rays of sunset, its wings spread in flight. He thought about the matching one on Rebecca's shoulder, how they designed them together when they were young and thought matching tattoos meant forever. They'd been wrong about forever, but maybe they'd been right about phoenixes, about burning down and rising again, about learning to fly even with broken wings, about finding your way back to where you belonged, even if the path was longer and harder than it should have been. In the treehouse, Grace stirred in her sleep and murmured something that sounded like Dad. And Jason felt his heart expand with the kind of love that hurts because it's too big for one person's chest to contain. This was his family now, messy and complicated, and not at all what he'd planned, but real, so beautifully, impossibly real.